Dr. Josie Auger has served as Indigenous Peoples as an experienced senior administrator and elected leader for Bigstone Cree Nation, Treaty 8. And she's worked with colleagues from Athabasca University and nationally as a principal investigator, co-applicant, and collaborator on research projects with the University of Calgary, McGill University, the University of Montreal, the University of Saskatchewan, Thompson Rivers University, and Wilfred Laurier University. Dr. Auger's current fields of study include Indigenous Studies, focusing on research, health, legal traditions, environment, architecture, history, and culture. Just to let you know that she will have a presentation at the end. We'll have a short Q&A for the last 15 minutes.
All that really means, everybody, is that I like to have partnerships and create partnerships with different people. Danse kakiao mstehe aske squeo and sigason wabaskotsinia, and I greet all of you today. My Cree name is Big Earth Woman, and my English name is Josephine Auger. Actually, I'll just share a little bit of a story about my name and why ancestors are like so important. See, my birthday comes up next month, and I was born during a blizzard and on a reserve up in Bigstone Cree Nation, on one of the reserves. And so my Japan, which is my great-grandmother, she walked in that blizzard to go to the church to have me baptized. So my mom asked her to name me. So she named me after her mother, Josephine, and so that would have been my Danskutapan, Josephine, and then her, Christine, was my Japan's name, the one who walked in the blizzard. So I share that with you today to introduce a little bit about myself and where I'm from, and acknowledging also, like Dr. Diana, my ancestors as well too. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the personhood of rivers and the journey. When I was writing up the abstract for this presentation, I was thinking that I would share a journey. But before I begin talking about that journey, I wanted to ask our board members that are in the room to please stand up. This is Brian DeHeer. Hi, Brian. Hi. And also, I'd like to acknowledge our staff that are here as well. Please stand up. Thank you. And I'd like to talk a little bit about this journey because it's, like Diana had mentioned earlier, like we as academics, we're sharing information, we're here to educate, but we can't say we really know anything or everything, right? And that's true. And so we begin our journey with acknowledging our limitations as human beings with humility, and acknowledging that I wouldn't be here today as a board member for Keepers of the Water if it wasn't for the organization and if it wasn't for the staff that uphold the organization as well. So I'm very, very grateful. So yesterday we were having like a strategic planning session, and it was really interesting because we were talking about what are some of the moments that you're proud of, the moments that are significant to you in relation like to water. Nippy, in Cree we say nippy. And I listened, and some people had like years of experience with the Old Man River, with late Milton Born with a Tooth, and they've had a lot of experience even with going to Standing Rock, and there was so much experience in the room. So I come here today, and even though my Cree name is Mstehe Askesquil, Big Earth Woman, I feel like I'm relatively like new to this whole process. So I feel like I feel humble today, and I feel very respectful as I relate to you all, and hope that I'm able to learn from you as you also learn from me in this journey. So, what was I proud of? No. So I was really happy. Like, I was so surprised when, Crystal and Josie indicated that there was this group of people, this youth group, the Decho youth group up in the Northwest Territories. They wanted a presentation based on this report that Crystal, do you want to stand up, Crystal? Yeah. I'm going to give her some exercise here. So Crystal was really helpful. So she helped to co-author a report, and so she's the lead author on the paper, and the paper is on the website. And I was grateful for her. She would just come back to me, and we kind of talk about different things. I'd also like to ask Elder Bert Bull to please stand up, because I know you're here. This is Elder Bert. He's from Musqueam, and he's also one of the sources that I reference in the paper. So thank you. I wanted to begin with talking a little bit about that paper and talking about the journey. So, but before I begin, I might as well go to the next slide. So I work for Athabasca University, and I'm in Indigenous Studies, but located in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, and this is the land acknowledgement here. I say that Treaty 6, 7, and 8 are in Alberta. Alberta is within Treaty 6, 7, and 8, contrary. And these are the First Nations and Métis peoples in whose lands we're on. I don't know what you think of land acknowledgements, and if you think land acknowledgements are effective for anything or not. Where are we going with land acknowledgements? And that's something that I'd like us to think about as we go forward in this meeting. Next slide. Thank you, Nigel. Nigel's from Cold Lake, and he was willing to help do the slides for me if I was going to stand up here, so he could do this recording and whatnot. So thank you, Nigel. So what I thought I'd do is I would talk about an introduction to this journey of understanding the legal personhood of water. And then I'm going to kind of talk about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as important to the legal personhood of water, and also the UN Sustainable Development Goals. I want to highlight the Indigenous connections of relationality to the earth and to the water, and I guess share some case studies from around the world and in Canada. We can go to the next slide. So before we know that the experiences of Indigenous peoples are the original people of Turtle Island. We know that colonialism impacted the social fabric of Indigenous peoples, and we know that Indigenous people are subsumed under Canadian laws, like the Indian Act. The Canadian Constitution 1982, Section 35(2), refers to Aboriginal peoples as the Indian, Inuit, and Métis peoples. 3 distinct peoples with traditional territories, languages, and culture, and the 2021 census counted 1.8 million Indigenous people in Canada. Many Indigenous peoples have experienced removal from their homelands to reserves, being denied the opportunity to speak their language and express their culture, with assault to their mind, body, spirit, and feelings. We have been treated as second-class citizens, resulting in marginalization and vulnerability, and the systems are unfamiliar to many Indigenous peoples, such as the court system. It's an unfamiliar territory because those laws are not our laws, and we didn't create those laws, but we're affected all by those laws. But despite all of these like experiences that we've had, and there are so many more, understanding like who you are, and I'm not here to make the white people here in the room feel bad. This is, we're just presenting the context of the situation and the and also like other non-Indigenous people. So let's shake that off, everybody. Shake that off. Okay, let's shake that off. That's good. Okay, so I've been fortunate enough to have listened to like a number of Gihtiayak elders, and you know, they share like many things in many different contexts. And one of the interesting points that I always remember was when you know who you are as an Indigenous person, that it gives definition and clarity to your life. So when you believe that you have a connection to Indigenous knowledge, you're an empowered guardian. And I want to come back to this because when I start to highlight the connection, I can't emphasize enough like the importance of balance, balancing all of the technology, all of the bombardment of Western civilization on our lives, but balancing that with our land-based culture, language, curriculum in our life and in our, as individuals, within our families, our communities, and our nation. So in the report that Crystal and I were co-authoring, we referred to like this idea of ancestors, Gihtiayak, our ancestors, our Tapans, our Danska Tapans, and so on, that the ancestral memory is blood memory. And we hear about blood memory a little bit like out there in some social media. Sometimes we hear about that, or we hear people say something about blood memory. But then like we wonder, okay, well, what is that about? So blood memory impacts powerfully on the lives of Indigenous peoples, and it's a concept that is not present in multiple academic discourses relating to and impacting directly on Indigenous lives. The quote is by Dr. Cora Weber-Pillwax, a Métis scholar from Calling Lake. So, and Calling Lake is a mixed community, and there is a Jean-Baptiste Gambler Reserve there, part of Bigstone Cree Nation. So she's in the neighboring community to Wabasca. So as Cree people, you know, we're kind of trying to balance like this knowledge. Okay, so what is blood memory, and why is it absent in academia? So I asked Elder Bert Bull in 2021 if there was like Nihiawewin word for blood memory, and he shared Ikisk sum kweyakimi kumno, and that is a word that describes the feelings that remind Nihiawa Cree people that the blood is like a river that reminds us of our hurt, and to heal from that and move forward. See, for so long, there's always been an acknowledgement in Western science of like the mind and the body, and they leave the spirit for religion and feelings and emotions, and well, the spirit part of it is, and the emotions are not usually addressed. So when we talk about blood memory as this abstract kind of concept, and to acknowledge our hurt, and to acknowledge our experiences, and to acknowledge our feelings, we come to this conversation today at Keepers of the Water from this place, this holistic place, this sacred space that we're in, talking about these things. When we hear people talking about like creation. When we hear people talking about where we come from and where we go to when we die and when we become a woman and when we give birth and when we give life, so it takes on so much more meaning. Next slide. And so there is a lot of differences, like in our worldview, compared to like non-Indigenous peoples. So this idea of anthropomorphism is this idea that human beings are not really a part of nature, that we're kind of above nature. It takes that view. Whereas when we're thinking about like the environment, we and our relationship to the environment, we believe that we're a part of the environment, that we're part of a Mother Earth that is alive, that is a living being, and that everything on this earth is a living being, and therefore that we're connected to everything around us, from the rock, to the sun, the moon, the stars, even that cosmos, the thunder, the lightning, the rainbow, to like acknowledging all of the birds that fly, the four-legged, the two-legged, and the creatures of the water, the little insects, the earth, the air, the fire, the water, everything, the wind. We're all connected to everything. And so this holistic view is sometimes like not understood. And that because everything is related, and we call this like relationality to all beings, that we respect all beings, that there's a reciprocal nature of all beings, with all beings, and we have a responsibility as well. Dr. Cora Weber Pillwax refers to those as the 3 R's of relationality. And we also want to make sure like our research is relevant to our communities. And so it's really important that we acknowledge that. And so when I talk about relationality to all living beings, this also brings us back to this idea of our connection and what do we learn from this whole experience. So, however, when we're not understood and we have our traumas and we're trying to, and this is what we were talking about like yesterday in our strategic planning, is how do we communicate? How do we communicate well about like water when we carry traumas, we carry that hurt, we carry that blood memory with us? How are we supposed to communicate this and be understood, right? So, because there's these different worldviews and people kind of like view resources, they use that word resources to talk about like economic development. They're not really acknowledging that those things that they're extracting or cutting down are living beings. And so when we try to speak our feelings, we have to acknowledge that we can face like intimidation and violence on both sides. So there's like a concern about that. And even though there have been peaceful efforts to exercise control over traditional lands, that people can be accused of like treason or terrorism. And so, however, we have to acknowledge the harms done by companies and allowed by governments to do that. So there becomes a fear of reprisal, just as there is a fear of accountability. It's kind of like an abusive relationship, seriously, because an abused person doesn't really want to identify their abuse. And the abuser certainly doesn't want to come forward to identify that they're abusing. And yet there's like so many people impacted by that abusive relationship. So there's fears. So I'm going to ask someone here, how do we, and maybe you come to this at the end of the conversation, but when we come to the last 15 minutes, we can talk about how do we overcome those fears. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm just wondering, I'll pause on that slide for a sec. So you came here today not to talk about abusive relationships. I don't want to trigger anybody. But certainly, like if there was, if somebody needed to talk about anything later, like there are people here that could listen. So we're here because we're talking about the rights of nature movement, and we're talking about how it sort of came to be. We're also talking about environmental personhood, or what they call the legal personhood, which is a result of successive governments around the world failing to protect the waters. And we're also here to talk a little bit about the toxic tailings ponds into the Athabasca River, a tributary of the Decho River. So back to Keepers of the Water. So Crystal and I were communicating via email, and we received this request from the Decho youth group. And we had been in our strategic planning sessions yesterday and acknowledging that legal personhood is something maybe that we need to educate people about. And so part of that meeting with the Decho youth group also involved like cross-cultural communication, because they're Dene people, I'm a Cree person, but I still wanted to have like protocols as a Cree person given to me. So they sent the tobacco to me like via Canada Post, and I was uncomfortable with it because I was like, not because of the tobacco, but just because like I'm a humble human being. I don't know everything. So what am I going to do? How am I going to talk about what legal personhood is? So I put that like into my cabinet for a little while. And then I later on came to sit with the tobacco and pray. And I was grateful because one of the tutors at Athabasca University, Roxanne Pollock, shared with me her paper. We got it into a conversation, her thesis, and I'm going to refer to some of what she says in that document as well later. So I'll pause there. You're going to have a hard time cutting and pasting this for YouTube if you're going to use it, because I'm kind of all over the place. So I wanted to take another step back, an even further step back, because I created this PowerPoint, and I think I kind of like need to go with the flow that way. So I'm going to kind of meander over into the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which was declared in 2007, but didn't receive royal assent until last year on, I think it would have been National Aboriginal Peoples Day, June 21st, 2021. And it took that long for UNDRIP to be brought forward. I remember, I won't comment there because that's kind of funny. I think about, I think there was an NDP member of parliament who spoke out against the UNDRIP not being brought forward, and he said some outrageous comments that he later ended up having to apologize for. So On the surface, like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples seems like a good thing. Next slide. And so, we know that people want to engage freely. Indigenous peoples have the right to engage freely in their traditional and other economic activities. So when you were talking about water, and traditionally, a lot of that was hunting, fishing, trapping, gathering, harvesting, and other economic activities. It's opening the door to other economic activities should they wish to go down that road. But yet it uses that language that we've subsisted and we're entitled now to just and fair redress under UNDRIP. So you'd be compensated if you had to be moved, if you had to be relocated someplace else or anything like that. Next slide. We also have the right to traditional medicines, maintain our health practices, including the conservation of their vital medicinal plants, animals, and minerals. So we know, like, in the water, there's a lot of medicine, like, within the water. A lot of people had spent time, traveling river systems, looking for medicines for their families and stuff like that. So if this is our right, to use our traditional medicines and to maintain our health practices, then, and without any discrimination, that's acknowledged here in Article 24. And because we have a right to enjoy the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. I was at a meeting I think it was in November, and they were talking about how life expectancy for First Nations has dropped from, I think, about an average of 71 to an average of 66. And this was, why is that? Why has the life expectancy of First Nations people dropped drastically in these last few years? And yet we also have UNDRIP, which says that we have this equal right to enjoy the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. There was this elder a long time ago, like back in the 1990s. Her name was Elder Agnes Smallboy, and she had said that we have to use our medicines before they're outdated. And I think about that like in different ways, because medicines can expire just as other things can expire. They can become outdated that way. But also they can become outdated in the way that if we're not passing on this knowledge, then we're not also fulfilling our responsibilities to the next generation. Next slide. So we also have this distinctive spiritual relationship that's acknowledged here in UNDRIP, and we also use the lands, territories, waters, and we think about this like future generations ahead, and you've seen that like in other presentations. So we're acknowledging that this is what UNDRIP is saying, and this is what it's saying in respect to water. Next slide. And we have the rights to the lands, territories, and resources that we've occupied, used, and acquired. And we also says that Indigenous peoples have the right to own, use, develop, and control their lands. And then, see, they document like what the rights are, but they're also acknowledging like what the role of the state is, the government. States shall give legal recognition and protection to these lands, territories, and resources, and such recognition shall be conducted with due respect to the customs, traditions, and land tenure systems of the Indigenous peoples concerned. So that's hopeful. Next slide. States shall establish and implement, in conjunction with Indigenous peoples, concerned a fair, independent, impartial, open, and transparent process, giving due recognition to Indigenous peoples' laws, traditions, customs, and land tenure systems, to recognize and adjudicate the rights of Indigenous peoples pertaining to their lands, territories, and resources. So really, like, all that is, I think, what we need to do, and what I told the Decho youth, and there were a few people there who were pursuing like legal studies, is that we need to advocate for legal pluralism in this country. Legal pluralism means that there isn't just this law that was brought over, that we also have our own laws as well, but we need to further develop them in that way. So next slide. And this talks about the right to redress for compensation for all of the things that have been confiscated, taken, occupied, used, or damaged without their free, prior, and informed consent. And so it's really about like monetary compensation for the harms done, which we know that, you know, we cannot, what was that? There was a saying before that when the last tree has fallen, there was some like quote about that, but also recognizing that we cannot live just on money alone, that we need to have that relationship with clean drinking water and so forth. And we know housing and homelessness are the two top issues facing, like, I'd say at least in the top few issues facing like Indigenous peoples. Next slide. Indigenous peoples have the right to the conservation and protection of the environment and the productive capacity of their lands and territories and resources. And states shall establish and implement assistance programs for Indigenous peoples for conservation and protection without discrimination. And when it talks about hazardous materials there, states shall take effective measures to ensure that no storage or disposal of hazardous materials shall take place in the lands or territories of Indigenous peoples without their free, prior, and informed consent. So when we think about like tailings ponds and these rivers, a lot of things have happened without like the free, prior, and informed consent. So I guess these programs are supposed to be for monitoring, maintaining, and restoring the health of Indigenous peoples. So baseline studies, I suppose, as developed and implemented by the peoples, should be implemented. Next slide. It's almost depressing, you know? It's so depressing. So this really talks about like good faith, free and informed consent, and that the states have to consult and cooperate, and that they're supposed to provide effective mechanisms for just and fair redress for any such activities, and appropriate measures shall be taken to mitigate adverse environmental, economic, social, cultural, or spiritual impact. Next slide. So these are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and when you look at partnerships are really important for achieving the 17 goals to transform the world. They're saying to have no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation. But what I wanted to point to is number 13, climate action, that we need that to have a sustainable and healthy planet. Number 14 is life below the water, oceans, the fish, the kelp, all of the animals, life on land as well. And so these goals were implemented in, I think it was 2015, and this came after the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So having acknowledged like these goals, it brings us back to the situation along the Decho and Athabasca rivers. There are four, next slide, there are four rivers that lead into the Decho, which means big river and is a Dene word, but that it was formerly, like, I guess they refer to it as the Mackenzie River. So I wanted to come back now to the Indigenous connections, relationality to the earth and the water. So I was sitting there with the tobacco, and then it's a powerful process when you believe, when you have that belief system in the things that you're doing. And in addition to having like Roxanne share some of her paper with me, like it came to me. Because like, you know, when we do our little ceremonies, when we're praying too, we're always supposed to like sing a song. And songs are very much a part like of our culture and our traditions. So when I was sharing with the Decho youth group, I was so humbled to be with them and to share this. And I'd ask you to close your eyes, because I'm shy, yeah. So I was sitting there, and I was thinking back to this song. And the song was given to me by a family member from Bigstone, whose father passed the song to him. And it is a sacred song to me. So I'm not going to sing the words, but I will hum the song. I don't have anything like a rattle or anything. So, and then it hit me that like our spirit, the spirit that walks the land, that helps us when we're down, helps us to stand up, helps us to walk, is a spirit that is like helping to take care of this land, who owns this land. And so then I come back to the beginning of the presentation when I was talking about when you know who you are, like as an Indigenous person, your everything has more meaning. Songs have more meaning, the visions have more meaning, your understanding has more meaning. So we had this. We had this. It's ancestral knowledge. It's our blood memory. It's our feelings. It's ikisk sum kwayaki mi kumno. It's remembering that we as Indigenous people, and in particular, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous women in the room. We have a special relationship to Mother Earth, and we have a special relationship and responsibility for the land. And we have to believe that just because blood memory, just because these things are not acknowledged in Western academic discourse, this doesn't mean that they do not exist. They exist in our blood, just as they've existed in our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, and so on. And it doesn't matter if you live in the city or that you live in the country. Mind you, I like living in the country more than living in the city. But when you're out on the land and when you're out in your own traditional territory and you feel the trees and you feel them welcoming you home and you see the rivers and the lakes, you feel that connection. Yesterday in our strategic planning workshop, we did this we had a moment there. We had a little group of youth. They weren't necessarily youth, but they were playing the role of youth. And we put the youth like in the center of the circle, and then we had the rest of us who were role playing like as mothers and fathers, as grandmothers. We were all around them. Because like, we want to think about a good future. We want to think about a good future for the young people. And we asked everybody to close their eyes again. And then they did. People are good listeners. No. And we did almost like a little prayer. It was like a little prayer for those children. Because those children are looking to us, and we have to think at least like a generation ahead, right? Because we're supposed to be thinking 7 generations ahead, just as our ancestors thought of us 7 generations back. And even when I think about like Treaty 6 in 1876 that was signed, that would be about 7, we're at the point of 7 generations. So back then when they were signing Treaty 6, which we're here today, that's 7 generations. I think about roughly about 20 years would be about a generation to create. So 7 generations forward. Who can do the math on that one? What are we looking at? So that's how far we want to be able to think about, and we put our youth in the center because we want them to have that hope. We want them to feel good. We want them to know that people are taking action in some way. And so we're acknowledging that they're carrying the traumas, actually. They're carrying trauma from Inuit people, Métis people, First Nations people. They're carrying that. And so we need to help them. We need to help them because they're going to be advocating more for the water, and they want to be able to come at it from a good-hearted place, a place of understanding, so that people know that, because we are not the trauma. We are not the trauma. Things that might have happened to us, but that's not who we are. Next slide. So what can we leave? What can we give them? What can they take forward? Well, we want to go back to this idea of legal pluralism because we have like our own laws. We know that this colonialism impacted the social fabric of Indigenous peoples. You know, one of our laws on kinship, Wakuhtuin, the Indian Act had impacted that because people couldn't leave the reserves. So there are certain laws like on these things about our bloodlines and taking care of our blood. I went to Kyrgyzstan, I think before COVID happened, and I went into Yurt and I met with the Kyrgyz people there, and we talked about 7 generations, and they said, we have that too. Really? Yeah. Really? No, just kidding. So, yeah, they talked about that, and then they talked about like their bloodline. But we know because like even like the social fabric of colonialism, that's impacted us, and like so many things have impacted us. And but when you understand, like you listen to elders, you listen to the creation stories, you listen to the teachings, you understand the lodges, you know some songs, that's going to help to create that legal pluralism, because that's where our laws come from. And I'm sure Jimmy Ochis will be able to present and talk about that as well. So by practicing it, we are practicing what is inherent to us, our inherent right, and that we are sovereign people, and that, you know, as Diana was talking about, that only nations make treaties, sovereign nations, and that's who we were before and at the time of treaty. And so we can just go to the next slide. So self-determination, creating conditions for stability and well-being based on peaceful, friendly relations of respect for equal rights and self-determination. It means to be free to determine political status, pursue social, economic, and cultural development, and that Macklem describes sovereignty as the legal expression of collective difference. And that might be like in the context of Canadian laws, like, but at the same time, according to our own ways, we are sovereign because it is our collective difference. And so I hope that the leaders that are in the room, leaders are here, that they will press for legal pluralism going forward. And that's what we'd want. That we would want one tool, important tools to pass on to the youth, important tools for us today to use to recognize our relationship to the water, our relationship to the rivers. Next slide. So this is one of the early books on sacred law by John Burroughs. He's an Anishinaabe scholar from, I think, the University of Victoria. And in these stories, they talk about like creation. And along this journey of sharing with the Decho youth group, I was also asked to present at the Star of the North in St. Albert to a Christian group of people. And so I wanted to kind of foreshadow that as I continue to talk. So these are, our sacred laws are very much like respected, and there's very much respected, and people believe and live by these teachings and to the best of their human ability. Next slide. And so when we talk about like natural law, we're also talking about that antohtimtik, that interconnectedness from one heart to another heart, recognizing all of the different, like the sun, the plant, the sun, the cosmos, the earth, the whole ecosystem, everything. And we acknowledge this holistically from a place of balance, mind, body, spirit, and feelings. Next slide. So I'm going to refer back to our paper that we worked on. So actually, I'll go here. I'll just refer to these slides. So some of the things that Roxanne was referring to in her case studies of the Wangani, Ganges, and Yamuna rivers as legal living entities. So we talked a little bit about this anthropocentric relationship to the earth, that humankind is a central important focus of existence. We need to decolonize those myths, because that's really not how it is. Thinking in an anthropocentric way is really perpetuating capitalism, and it is something that we need to decolonize, because we have to recognize that we're abusing the earth. So we address the imbalance by recognizing the ecosphere, and that the rights framework of legal living rivers denies an ecocentrism-based inequality and interrelatedness of all living on Earth. So we don't want that anthropocentric view. We want to promote the idea of equality and interrelatedness of all living on Earth. So then she advocates for a myth, that we need an evolving, emerging myth, as she refers to it, to drive the social change, and refers to a few cases on wild law or earth jurisprudence that indicates legal and property rights would need to be completely restructured in order to give equal legal standing to nature. Next slide. So, let's see, I've got to balance these out. In 2011, a provincial court in Ecuador became the first to legally recognize the rights of nature when they ruled in favor of the Vilcabamba River in Ecuador against damaging road construction. In 2017, the Wangani River on New Zealand's North Island was the first in the world to be granted legal personhood. Quebec's Magpie River becomes first in Canada to be granted legal personhood. India's Ganges and the Yamuna rivers and its tributaries were declared as legal entities by this High Court in 2017 due to pollution. Next slide. Okay, so in February 2021, the Innu Council of, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, Iqaluit and the Mingani Regional County Municipality recognized the Magpie River in Quebec, and they did it by offering twin resolutions that were adopted. And then there's another place, the Adéhazy, a protected area in the NWT, is an Indigenous protected and conserved area where Indigenous peoples' role is to protect and conserve. So and this is a picture of the Magpie River on the north shore of the St. Lawrence River, and this kind of gives a little bit of context to that. It is happening here in Canada as well, and there are several places like in the north where they still have outstanding self-government land claims happening. So the youth were questioning what if they were to try to declare legal personhood, that what effect would it have? How could that happen given that? So that's where the leaders would need to take active measures for the river. So in 2008, Ecuador, they acknowledged the rights in their constitution. I think we said that, the Villa Cabamba River. In 2016, Colombia's Constitutional Court declared Atrato River had the subject of rights. In 2017, India's court ruled the Ganges and Yamuna rivers should be granted the same legal rights as people. And in 2017 in New Zealand, the Wanganui River was recognized as a legal entity as part of a negotiated settlement between the government and Maori people. Mind you, I think the Maori people are the majority, elected into their government, so they had that power to do that. Next slide. So what would it mean then to have rights of the river? In accordance with Innu customs and practices, the Alliance has granted the river 9 rights: the right to the flow, the right to respect for its cycles, the right for its natural evolution to be protected and preserved, the right to maintain its natural biodiversity, the right to fulfill its essential functions within its ecosystem, the right to maintain its integrity, the right to be safe from pollution, the right to regenerate and be restored, and perhaps most importantly, the right to sue. Whether this case will be a success or failure for Canadians remains to be seen. And the link is there on where this information came from. So that would be the rights of the river. So the river is a legal person. Next slide. So when I presented to the Star of the North, the Christian group in St. Albert, I asked them, what have we learned from the Bible through Genesis? And because like Roxanne Pollock explains that Adam and Eve were asked to leave the Garden of Eden. And because they were asked to leave the Garden of Eden, for her, what she took from that was that they were, that separation, that disconnection happened to the land and the places. And so, if that disconnection has happened and over here, and it continues to happen over here, and we don't see things like blood memory in Western academic discourse, or being able to talk about these points, that we need to think about why is sharing stories important. And when we think about the word Decho, that does mean like a big river. So are we thinking of the river as a goddess? And so is the river a sacred entity? Are rivers that flow into the ocean different from rivers that do not flow directly? How is the logic of river pollution and even war, invasion, geopolitical territorialization affecting the sacredness of a river? Who are the leaders that build relationships with government, and why is it important? So I wanted to take a moment to go back to a little bit about the role of Indigenous women, and that I also acknowledge the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. We have a sacred relationship with the earth. We're life givers. All of the waters that flow with us, within us, are also very sacred. And as life givers, we have that special relationship with the earth. I think Dr. Sylvia McAdam had put on YouTube as well that there was the role of the women speaking for the land around treaty making time, and the Treaty 6 area was acknowledged. But through colonialism and patriarchy, women were pushed aside, and even if they married a non-Indigenous person, they had lost their rights. And whereas a non-Indigenous woman marrying an Indigenous man would gain rights up until 1985. So we need to really support Indigenous women, Indigenous young women, and to be able to have them feel included and upheld in this movement as well. And acknowledging our Indigenous men as well and our Two-Spirit people to bring balance to this work that we're doing. Because like the eagle, the elders are like the visionaries, the head of the eagle, and the wings are like the mother and the father, and the children are like in the middle, and the youth are the tail feathers. It takes everybody to make that like an eagle to fly and to be able to enact social change. Next slide. And do you have any questions?